Hey everyone, so this week we're going to be talking about internal regulation. This lecture is going to be primarily about temperature regulation, and then we're going to talk about hunger and thirst in the second video for this week. All right, so let's start with this concept of homeostasis. Homeostasis is basically our body's way of keeping different things at a balance or keeping them in check, so to speak. So homeostasis in animals is triggering physiological and or behavioral activities to help keep different variables in check. So that includes temperature regulation and other processes. One kind of additional piece to that is blood levels. You know, our homeostasis is kind of helping keep check on our blood levels and the different things in our blood: water, oxygen, glucose, protein, etc. So homeostasis is kind of making sure everything is at the right level. If you think about, you know, the thermostat in your house and how, you know, you set the thermostat at a certain temperature, and when that temperature gets higher than you want it to be, what happens? The air conditioner turns on. And, you know, during the cold seasons, you know, when that temperature gets lower than you want it to be, the heater or the furnace will turn on. So if you think about it, homeostasis for humans and animals is kind of like the thermostat of your house, especially when it comes to temperature regulation. So basically, it's keeping body variables in check or within a fixed range or set point, because sometimes that fixed range is so narrow that it could be even a single point that your body is kind of in tune with. And if the number of that variable goes above or below that specific number, the body responds. An example of that is calcium. So if calcium falls below a 0.16 grams per liter, our body basically becomes signaled as being calcium deficient. So it will release calcium from the bones. And on the flip side, if we have levels of calcium over 0.16 grams per liter, then our bones will store the extra and then excrete the rest. So that's one example of one of the levels that our body is in tune with the actual set point that our body is aware of. Negative feedback is the concept of us basically trying to fix disturbances of set points. So it's the processes that reduce discrepancies from set points. So in other words, our bones releasing the calcium is an example of negative feedback when we are trying to basically fix that disruption of our calcium. Another point to bring up is allostasis. So what's the difference between allostasis and homeostasis? So allostasis is our adaptive way of our body anticipating a need or a possible disruption in our homeostasis, and then sort of basically accounting for that by doing something to avoid a disturbance or a serious error, rather like basically kind of prepping for that instead of actually responding to a change. So if you think about some animals who prepare for like the cold seasons, you know, they may start making some changes or putting some food in their environment, in their home or whatever, to prep for that cold season so that they can avoid having a problem where they don't have enough food or they're starving. One example for us as human beings is that if you can think back to one of our first lectures where we talk about the different branches of the nervous system, we've got that fight, flight, or freeze or sympathetic nervous system that responds when we anticipate danger or sense danger. Even if we're not necessarily in danger, our body responds if we sense danger so that we can be ready to respond. So our body becomes ready to fight or flight. And so that's an example, again, of allostasis. So rather than waiting for that danger to occur and have some kind of disturbance in our homeostasis, our body prepares so that we can just avoid having injury or major disturbance in our homeostasis. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about about what all of this means for controlling our body temperature. So us as humans and a lot of other mammals, our bodies are kind of set to be at a certain temperature. So in our case, it's normally around 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we have this basal metabolism. So we have this metabolism that's just constantly working to try to keep our bodies at that set temperature range that we want to be at. And the average young adult actually expends about 2,600 kilocalories on basal metabolism. So all of these calories are going towards the energy it takes to keep our bodies at a certain temperature. And that is actually twice as much energy as it takes for all of our other activities combined. So there's a lot of energy being spent to keep our temp at that point. There is a difference between ectothermic and endothermic animals. So ectothermic animals are kind of like what some people think of as cold-blooded animals, like reptiles, amphibians, and they're not necessarily cold-blooded. They're kind of referred to as cold-blooded because when it's cold outside, they will be cold because their body temperature is more about their environment. So their body temperature is going to be pretty close to what their environmental temperature is. So if you've ever owned any kind of reptile, you sometimes have to, have like a heat rock or something like that to help keep them warm, because their bodies match the temp of their environment. And so it depends on those external environments. And in contrast, us as humans and other mammals, we're endothermic, so that also includes birds. And so we generate enough body heat to remain significantly above the temperature of our environment, usually. Obviously, if it's 100-something degrees outside, that's a little different. And for when we are in those extreme heat situations, we do have cooling mechanisms to still kind of try to keep that body at that same temp of around 98 degrees. So cooling mechanisms that we have, probably you may already be thinking of some in your head. We do things like sweat. We sweat to basically help cool us off. And for animals or mammals that don't sweat, you may, think of a dog, you see them panting, they may lick themselves, just to kind of try to help themselves cool off. So we as mammals kind of have ways to try to keep ourselves cool in those extreme heat situations. And then on the flip side, when it's extremely cold, we have ways that we try to warm ourselves. And actually, the next slide, we're really going to go into survival of extreme cold. So I'll hold off on some of that info until then. But that's basically the difference between ectothermic and endothermic animals and how we control our body temperature. So let's go into more about the extreme cold survival. So we have endothermic and ectothermic animals that can survive extreme cold. So let's talk about us as humans, endothermic first. So the ways that we can kind of keep ourselves warm, if you think about the last time you were cold, what did you do? You might have been shivering, or you may have noticed that your skin became more cold because your body just naturally kind of brought the blood more towards your vital organs. And, kind of brings the blood away from the skin and brings it more towards the areas that need to be protected, like your vital organs. So it shifts that blood away. And we also do behavioral things. We have heaters, blankets, we have different places we try to get to stay warm. So as endothermic animals, that's what we do to help survive these extreme cold situations. So what about ectothermic, those reptiles, amphibians, fish? Some of them still survive in really cold temperatures. So how does that happen? Because if their body temperature is matching the environment, they're vulnerable to having their blood freeze. And at that point, ice crystals are going to basically harm their blood vessels and kill cell membrane. So it would kill the animal. But there are many ectothermic animals that actually avoid that by, number one, behavioral ways, burrowing to a warmer place, getting to a place that's more warm. And then you've also got some animals, and our text gives us the example of a wood frog that actually has physiological mechanisms where different chemicals will be released into the blood so that the blood can kind of move to some of the organs, so that when the frog does freeze, it can basically safely freeze and then dethaw, and its blood chemicals will kind of even back out, and it can go back to hopping away. So there, even ectothermic animals do have some mechanisms that can help them. So we've already talked about how us as humans have this, basically constant temperature we're trying to keep. And it is kind of a high temperature, that 98 degrees Fahrenheit. It's pretty warm. And so we have this constantly high temperature, and what is the reason for that? Why would we want to have that higher temperature? What do you think? So what we do know is that basically one of the benefits of that is our body's kind of warmed up and ready to go for activity at all times. A warmer animal will have warmer muscles. So if we're in danger and something is after us, or we need to go do something, our bodies as humans, we've kind of expended all this energy keeping this body temp ready so that we can just be ready to go. So that's definitely one benefit that helps with our survival as well. And if you think about animals who are more like reptiles, and in the cold weather, they have to move slower because their muscles are slow, or are cold and slower. So they're more susceptible to danger and getting hurt. So one question that you may ask yourself is why 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius? Why is that kind of our range? So our text does a really good job of sort of explaining that it's a good number for us because it keeps us warm, keeps us ready for activity, but at the same time, it's also not too high where there is a negative trade-off for that. So at a certain point, which our text highlights as 41 degrees Celsius or higher, proteins will actually begin to break bonds and lose their useful properties. So this temperature of 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius is actually a great balance for us, because it's not too hot where we're going to damage those protein properties, but it's also keeping us warm enough so that we're ready for fight or flight. When that system kicks in, or even just in general, walking or doing something, we're kind of ready to go because our body's already warmed up, so to speak. Now, in extreme cold temperatures, we may have to warm up by moving around a little bit first, but in general, that's sort of why we have that 98 degrees Fahrenheit number. So what about fevers? Many of us have experienced a fever before, normally in response to some kind of illness or infection, bacteria. So the fever is actually something that kicks in and increases that set point for the body temperature internally. So it's not, we don't get a fever because we're wrapped up in too many blankets. We get a fever because our body is responding to something. So that's why with a fever, we might shiver and sweat and have these chills and stuff because the temperature has changed internally. But it's something that an infection or illness is doing to the body and signaling our body to produce that heat. And so the hypothalamus is basically signaling our body to do that. And why would we do that? Why would we get a fever? Well, certain types of bacteria grow less vigorously when they're in a high temperature situation. So it's basically the immune system's way of working to try to, you know, battle that bacteria that it's fighting. So kind of like with our just general temperature, with fevers, there's a benefit to a fever to try to help the immune system out to fight bacteria and different illnesses. But if it gets above 109 Fahrenheit, that becomes a very, it basically it's life-threatening at that point if the fever gets that high. So a fever can be good to help the immune system. In other words, is kind of how our text explains it, but it's kind of like with our temperature in general, there's sort of at this point at 109 or above, it's kind of like the trade-off isn't worth it because it becomes deadly for the person who has a fever that high. So that's more about temperature. And how I wanted to end this particular lecture video is to talk about the brain mechanisms associated with this. So you may have saw even when we first started, the picture I had with the hypothalamus sort of highlighted for us. And that's because you're going to notice almost everything we're talking about in regards to internal regulation is related to the hypothalamus. So temperature regulation is definitely related to the hypothalamus, specifically the anterior hypothalamus, the preoptic area, which is anterior to the anterior hypothalamus. And these two are so close together and so closely related in what they're doing, which, you know, temperature regulation is what they're both associated with. You'll often see them referred to as the same, you know, kind of together, POA/AH. So you'll see that, and that's what it's referring to as these two together. And so these two together send info to the hindbrain's RAS nucleus to basically help the body know what it needs to do to help regulate temperature. So this is the image of that kind of blown up. So, you know, we know from previous lectures here, we've got our hypothalamus area, and if you kind of blow that up, these are the different areas we're talking about. So we've got the posterior, and here's that anterior pituitary. And so even anterior to that, we've got that preoptic area. So here's that preoptic area here. So you can see that's anterior even to that. So remember, anterior is kind of forward and posterior is backwards if you're thinking about your body. And here's an integration of temperature information. So it kind of just gives us sort of I like this little diagram or figure because it kind of shows us a flow chart of what we're talking about here. So if we get an infection or something our immune system is trying to fight off, it gives us an immune response that's going to secrete some prostaglandins and histamine, which will cue that POA/AH to go ahead and trigger that response of the fever. And then here's an example where, you know, we're just in an environment and the temperature, we're sensing the temperature differences on our skin, or temperature receptors in the brain and other organs could be triggered. And again, it's going to give that response of increasing the temperature, which will also be accompanied with shivering, sweating, heart rate, blood flow to the skin, etc. So all those different things associated with the change in the temperature. And this is also in your textbook, so you can review this and read more about it, as well as the pictorial diagram from the previous slide. So that is it on temperature regulation, and our next video is going to cover hunger and thirst. Thank you.